following on from the last session, this session is going to focus on PPI in academic publishing. So first up, we have Adrian Alcroft. Adrian is the editor-in-chief of the BMJ Open, which is an open access general medical journal that promotes transparency in the publication process by publishing reviewer reports and previous versions of manuscripts alongside the published article. Adrian has also worked as an associate editor on PLOS ONE and as a senior executive editor on the BMC series. Prior to working in publishing, Adrian spent several years at the University of Western Ontario conducting research using fMRI to map functional areas of the visual cortex. So we're going to hand over to Adrian now.
Yeah, thanks for inviting me to speak here today and be part of this panel, and I'm very sorry I can't be there. Yes, so my talk is about patient and public involvement statements in BMJ Open. So very quickly, overview, we'll look at how long we've been doing PPI statements in BMJ Open. We'll look at what authors see, and then in contrast to what they actually do, challenges and future work. And then I do also want to mention the BMJ, so our companion journal, and everything they're doing with PPI, because I think it's really impressive. Next slide. Those are my competing interests. Short form is I'm a professional editor, so this is my full-time job. BMJ, it's a company, we're for-profit, and BMJ Open is funded by article processing charges, and we do also advertise drugs and devices on the website. Next slide. So I think we just heard an overview. So we're a broad scope, open access, general medical journal. We're high volume, so around 4,000 articles a year. We're focused on research and research-related content, so we don't publish editorials, opinion pieces, commentaries. We publish study protocols and research articles. We use open peer review, which can mean different things to different journals, but at BMJ it means reviewers see the names of the authors, and authors also see the names of the reviewers. And in addition to that, we publish the reviews and all previous versions of an accepted manuscript alongside the article for full transparency. Acceptance rate is 31%, so even though we are a high volume journal, we do reject a lot of papers and publish anything which is sound and well reported, so there still is a lot of papers which are not up to our standard. We're part of what we call the BMJ family, which is the BMJ, BMJ Medicine, and BMJ Open. BMJ Publishing Group publishes around 70 other journals, but the BMJ family are really the core journals, which are run by professional editors, and we all have a similar ethos and philosophy when it comes to publishing and publication ethics. And my team at the moment is around 20 in-house editors, so we all work at BMJ. There's a picture of us on one of our socials at the bowling alley. Next slide. So we started publishing PPI statements in 2018, which I think makes us an early adopter. Outside of the BMJ, I think we were number 2 to start publishing PPI statements. And I'll go into what these involve in a second, but I think it's important to say that authors can't hide from this, so we made it really clear that if patients were not involved in designing and conducting the study, authors need to state this rather than just not include a statement at all. Next slide. So these are the core 6 questions we want authors to answer when they submit a paper to BMJ Open, and this is the same, I think, for all BMJ journals that publish PPI statements. So ideally, we want to hear at what stage in the research process patients or the publics were first involved, how the research question and outcome measures were developed with the patient and the public, how are they involved in the design of the study, the recruitment and conduct of the study, were patients and the public asked to assess the burden of the intervention and time required, and then how were or will they be involved in dissemination plans once the study is complete. Next slide. So I'm going to look at 2 different analyses of the actual statements in BMJ Open. One from 2018 and one from a few years later. So the first one was done by Amy Price, who I'm sure quite a few of you are familiar with. She was a patient editor for the BMJ and really integral in launching PPI statements in BMJ Open and the BMJ. And early on in the process, so back in 2018, she looked at 50 research papers to see the quality of the PPI statements. And she found that 96% had a PPI statement, even though it's required. And I think the main point there is that while we do require these statements, we don't and can't really police them. We just need to trust what the authors say. I think now it would be 100%, but even but early on, if people really wanted to evade it, they could. 64% stated that there was no PPI, so no patients public were involved in the design of the study, and 32% demonstrated adequate reporting of PPI, so kind of hit that minimum standard. Next slide. So a more thorough study was conducted a few years later. So this is from PPI statements in 2020, and there are 3,000 in total, so much bigger. And it was actually an article published in BMJ Open in 2022. And these researchers found that 20.6% of papers showed evidence of PPI, which is fewer than Amy Price's study, which I think is just down to the much larger sample size of 3,000 versus 50. But this article and this analysis showed some really key differences, which aren't surprising, but it's nice to have data to demonstrate this. So big regional differences. This ranged from the UK, where approximately 45% of the research articles and protocols had evidence of PPI, compared to China, where it was 4%. Methodological differences, so this is the methodology used in the research study itself. Mixed methods studies, and I think qualitative studies as well, had the highest rate of PPI, whereas simulation studies, which is like for example, prediction models for a pandemic, had the lowest, which kind of makes sense when you think about it. And similarly, subject area differences, mental health had the highest PPI, and medical education, which is sort of 1 degree removed from patients and the public, I guess, had the lowest. Next slide. So I think we can learn quite a lot from these two analyses, and also a few challenges follow from this. The first one is just that, and it's really clear that knowledge and acceptance of PPI varies massively across cultures. I think it's still a fairly new concept, but Europe, the UK, have integrated it really well into funding, peer review, and all of the different aspects of the research cycle. Whereas in China, I think there's just still a massive dissonance between our notion of PPI and how important that is, and just the relationship that exists between patients, researchers, and doctors in China. So I think it's still just an odd concept there. And kind of related to that, authors unfamiliar with PPI do confuse it with research participation, so they don't quite get this distinction of PPI is research actively carried out with or by members of the public and patients, as opposed to research being about them or for them, or directed at them. Other things we see, so authors incorrectly stating that PPI is not applicable. So we see this with systematic reviews, meta-analyses, and I think with that other paper that we showed, simulation studies. And I've been guilty of this myself, to be honest. So I do research on peer review and things like the quality of peer review and open peer review versus single blind. And we have forgotten until a late stage that we should be asking patients to comment on this research, because even though it's not really directly about patients in the public, it still impacts them. It's still going to be published in a medical research journal, and still the ultimate goal of this research is to help patients in the public, so they should be consulted. And then finally, this last one, which is just mainly a challenge with publishing in general, is that it's a trust-based system. Authors are trying to get their paper published, so if you say PPI is important, they might not, we want them to accurately say what they did, but they kind of just say what they think they want you to hear. So just having them be honest is always a challenge. Yeah, next slide. So future directions following on from this, I think the big one is just to continue to educate and inform about the importance of PPI, and to make sure that people do know that it's still relevant to systematic reviews, simulation studies, meta research, and that type of thing. And then really just educating parts of the world that are a little bit unfamiliar with it, which I think would be an interesting thing to discuss, because I do try to push it when I do outreach to China, but people sort of don't pay attention, aren't really that keen on it, and it is a big, big challenge, I think. We do also want to make PPI statements more prominent, so really raising it to the level of ethical approval and patient consent, just that it's foundational to research rather than this additional thing which is sort of optional. So I think we do want to, I think we have changed it so it's included in that metadata at the end of the article with the ethical approval and the consent. So I think that is good. And then the final future direction is just to, not just to give the authors a blank text box to say what they did, but to ask a little bit more directly these 6 different elements, so they're a little bit clearer on what we want and give us more relevant answers. Next slide. Unrelated to PPI statements, I did just want to say that another thing that I think BMJ Open is quite good at is publishing PPI exercises as distinct research submissions, so not as supplementary information to a trial, for example, if there's a PPI exercise that's qualitative study. We see it, if it's well done, as standalone research, and here's just a few examples of ones we've published, but there's a lot more. Next slide. And then I think it's really important because I think we do a good job on BMJ Open, but the BMJ does a really fantastic job, and they have Emma Doble, who is their patient and public strategy editor, and really encouraging patients as authors, which I know you've been talking about today, encouraging them to co-design research, encouraging patients to be involved in governance and strategy, and then also encouraging patients to act as peer reviewers, which is something the BMJ is great at. I think all research published in the BMJ has a patient peer reviewer, and honestly, patients are much more engaged and interested in doing peer review than our usual peer reviewers, and we've just started paying £50 for patient peer reviewers as well. Next slide. And this is just a quick mention that if you do want to act as a patient peer reviewer, there's a QR code you can scan to register, and I'm sure the BMJ will be in touch if they have relevant papers for you. Yeah, that's my presentation. Thanks very much.
Thanks so much for that, Adrian. It's great to see how things have changed and how more procedures and processes are being put in place to really encourage and facilitate not only people including PPI, but also reporting on it as well. We have time for 1 or 2 quick questions, just if anybody has a question for Adrian. I have a question. You mentioned about having to trust authors to accurately report PPI rather than just to say what they think you want to hear. And it really struck me that it's kind of similar with, risk of bias judgments as well, that, a lot of the time people are reporting on the things they know will be assessed in a risk of bias instrument, but actually whether that was actually done or not is, sometimes it's really hard to tell. It's really hard to tell the kind of grey area, and sometimes you get the sense that they're just reporting on a randomization process, but you're not actually sure whether they did it. Are we moving towards the need for kind of having safeguarding practices in place to kind of show evidence, or do we just need to operate on that system of trust?
Yeah, it's becoming a problem in all areas of research, really. And I think the one thing we can do is make sure that the PPI element of the study is reported as soon as possible. So if it's a clinical trial, it should be included in the trial registry. And on BMJ Open, we publish study protocols. So I think evidence that there's some sort of PPI exercise in the study protocol is really valuable. And to include details, and I guess I was trying to get at that in terms of answering those 6 distinct questions, that it should be detailed and not something vague. And yeah, as early as possible. But yeah, I mean, outside of that, there's not much you can do, especially with the volume of things that we publish. You can't really track down people and question them too much. But I guess the last thing I would say is that it all kind of ties together, and that including all of these trust elements in a paper just increases trust. So all of these little things add up. The details in the PPI statement, whether they've included a reporting guidelines checklist, whether they've kind of structured things as you'd want them to, whether they've picked the journal that's appropriate. All of those things do kind of add up, and maybe we just need to take a more holistic approach when it comes to these things as well.
Yeah, thank you. Any other questions? Over here. We have.
Hi, thank you. I'm Anna Carlsen from a research support unit in Denmark. And I wondered what you think about the whole co-authorship of patients and how you handle that at BMJ, because we quite often experience issues that they have to set up accounts and get random emails from a really weird address that they can't recognize and things like that. How are we going to do that in the future, you think?
Yeah, we try to be as flexible as possible, and I think we've just implemented a system where we don't require patient authors to have some sort of institutional affiliation, which we do require for academic authors, which is a safeguarding check, and it becomes a systems problem. But I think we have changed the system now that patient authors aren't required that thing. And it is kind of a process problem more than anything, and publishing uses really old and not very well done software. So I think we do need to make active efforts to improve it for patient authors, because they are the exception rather than the rule. And I think the best thing that we can do is just kind of educate and make sure that the people who are designing these systems know that there are exceptions and that we do need to be open-minded and make these things accessible to people who are not necessarily academics and not necessarily the people who tend to use these systems 20 years ago, but actually move forward a little bit.
Thanks very much, Adrian. Okay, so next I'm delighted to welcome Jessica Catchpole to give her presentation. So Jessica is a lived experience researcher who is passionate about smashing stigma and showing the brilliant things that people living with mental and physical health conditions can do despite of and because of their differences. She lives in Essex, England, and she has 2 cats.
So as mentioned, I'm Jessica Catchpole. I'm a lived experience researcher at City St George's University of London, and I'm also the PPI co-lead for our department. I also peer review for the Lancet Psychiatry from a lived experience perspective. Now, before we get started, I want to say that the reason I can have the pretty slides is because all the opinions are my own. And also, go easy on me, because when the plane broke down at Stansted yesterday, I left my notes on the plane, so I'm having to wing it. Okay. So, I want to tell you about the peer reviewing panel first. It was set up in 2019. It wasn't the first. I thought the BMJ was the first, and so I think that this is really, though they weren't the first, this is a bandwagon we can all jump on. Originally, there were 10 members, and now there are 6. It's still a really supportive group of people. We review around 6 papers a year, and we are paid for our time. We review for the Lancet Psychiatry mainly, but we've also branched out to occasionally do other journals as well. I personally have done about 45 peer reviews from a lived experience perspective, including 3 very, very large commissions. So what do we look for whenever we're peer reviewing your paper? The first thing is language. Person first, non-condescending, basically what you'd want to see said about yourself. Two examples that are on the less good side of the scale was a paper talking about smoking in the SMI community. Now, does that mean that everybody else was behind the sheds having a smoke and not inviting me? So the next one was a bit more personal to me because it talked about someone with depression as an intractable case. My depression is intractable. I am not intractable. The next is be careful with the conclusions you've drawn, just like he just mentioned there. I know that the struggle is real. I know that we all want to get published, and I know that you know the papers I'm talking about. Don't overstate your methods, because we can smell that from a mile away. Methods themselves, I'm not expected to know my logistic from my linear regression. What I'm there looking for is appropriateness and fairness. Have you dealt with people as people and not just data points? An example is, have you grouped people with mild or moderate depression alongside people with bipolar disorder? Because they're both affective disorders, right? Well, that might be appropriate sometimes, but we both know that those are very, very different kettles of fish, and we need to be mindful of that. Have you recruited a very white sample and then generalized it to a very diverse population? Don't do that. Have you basically repeated the mistakes of the past without actually listing it at least as a limitation? Again, don't do that either. Now, the last thing that we look for is the ick factor. That's a me term. The ick factor is basically we're reading your paper, and if it feels icky, we're going to call it out. My method is I do 3 reads. The first one is a sense check. The second one is making sure my sense check actually made sense. And if by the third one I'm still feeling there's something icky about your paper, I'm going to mention it. If I can't put my finger on it, I'm going to mention it privately to the editors to say this is something that needs a bit of extra scrutiny. But if I can put my finger on it, you better believe I'm going to be telling you, and my politeness is going to be inversely proportional to the amount of icky that was in that paper. So, PPI reporting, has it gotten better? Now, the Lancet Psychiatry published reporting guidelines in late 2023. Again, they weren't the first to do this. Again, I think BMJ was. And the purpose of them wasn't to shame or mandate PPI or bar publication, because that's not what it was for. It was to encourage people to report PPI in their work more honestly. So I had to look back through the 11 papers that I've reviewed since then. And look, caveat time, I wasn't looking for PPI necessarily when I first did the reviews. I can't find all the reviews that I've done. I might have missed some listing of PPI whenever I was looking for it. So again, if there's any mistakes here, blame me, not the Lancet Psychiatry. And let's face it, not every study type is best suited to PPI. So there are all those caveats, but I'd like to say my overall feeling is that not much has changed. Because when PPI is reported, it looks mostly like the first example there, which is good, but it's tokenistic. I'm so glad that their feedback and insights were taken on board. You know, that perhaps wrongly shows a lack of true collaboration. And the second quote is much better. First off, bonus points for disclosing lived experience with in a safe manner. But equally, I don't know which sections had one author review it from a lived experience sections. I don't know which one had all 3. And I don't know if they brought in external sets of eyes to have a look at what they'd done. And all of those things are really important to know. What is good, and what is giving me a lot of hope, is that I'm seeing much more lived experience focused research and qualitative research come across my computer screen. Obviously, I don't review every paper that the Lancet Psychiatry sees, but I'm finding that I'm seeing more of what I'd like to see in the world. So my overall verdict is it's not changed much, but it is moving in the right direction. I'd love to stand up here and tell you that we've now entered some kind of PPI utopia, but I can't, and I'm not going to. So what's the benefit of having peer reviewers from a lived experience perspective? The first is it makes your research better. It makes you rethink your assumptions, because all academics, myself included, come with our own biases and assumptions. It makes you perhaps consider your own disclosure, because normalizing is humanizing. We need to think about how we make the conditions we talk about seem a bit more human. It might improve your language if need be. It also has the potential to improve future research, because number one, our feedback might give you ideas for the future, because we might be looking at it in a way you weren't. But also, once you get your bright and shiny paper published, other people are going to see how you've done it, and they might emulate that compassionate style. And the third way is that it makes people's lives better. So I mentioned that I've written some comment pieces, or I might not. I don't know where I am, who I am at this point. I've published, I think, 10 comment pieces, and some of them were linked comment pieces, some of them were museum reviews or book reviews, but a couple of them were very, very personal observations of the stigma that people living with obesity and people living with type 2 diabetes face every day. And this is the opportunity, the first opportunity I've had to write from in a nonfiction way since university. So not only do I know that by doing the peer reviews that I'm making a difference, but I've had personal, building my brand opportunities. I've had things that have built my self-esteem. And let's face it, if I didn't know the editors of the Lancet Psychiatry, I would not be physically standing here right now. So in this world, it is still who you know. So think about ways that you can help people, help your PPI people become involved in ways that are outside the box. So, very, very important one here. If you're not in this room, and I know that everyone in this room is in this room for this reason, but if you're not in the room to improve patient care, then why are you here? Because right now, I have to believe this. I have to believe that more person-centered research will lead to better person-centered care. So, this is a good step. I'm very happy to be here, and I really appreciate the work that you do. I'd like to tell you about my day job now. As I mentioned, I work for City St. George's in London, and I work on the Pegasus project. Pegasus is a multifaceted, mixed methods. You'd think after 2 years I'd be able to get this right, but I never have. It is a multifaceted intervention to try to help people living with severe mental illness to improve their cardiometabolic health through peer support. One of the things that makes it really unique, again, I'm sure it isn't the first, but it makes it really unique, is that it's a lived experience team. There are 4 of us who all have lived experience of some form of mental distress and going through the mental health care system. And it was absolutely amazing to join the team because there was such an enthusiasm for getting co-production and co-design right. And it was the first time in my life that I'd ever been surrounded by people who were more enthusiastic than I was. And if you don't know what a lived experience researcher was, because when I was hired, I had no clue. And if that's also you, basically, we're kind of bridging the gap between PPI and being a researcher, or a real researcher. We're still expected to do the research work. We're all qualitative researchers. But we also have to bring our lived experience to work every day with us. And as a team of 4 lived experience researchers, it gives us a bit more lobbying power. So when an academic says, this is how this intervention should work, and with the co-production workshops, and with the lived experience advisory group, and with the focus groups that we did, all say different, we can gang up on that academic and say, no, this is what we want. So an example is, the way that the protocol paper was written originally had things like group clinics and psychoeducation. And so that was the original idea of Pegasus. But we came in and we said, nah, mate, ain't nobody going to that. I ain't going to that. So it's now much more focused on the touchy-feely side of things and making it more fun. My colleague has suggested that we have something where we throw something in every session, and I'm so on board with this. But just like, again, it's not going to be a co-production utopia. And the same pressures that apply to non-lived experience work apply to lived experience work. And so reality does tend to bite. Academic paternalism, short time frames, funding pressure, that all applies to us as well. And I suggest that it applies to us more because we might need more time off sick. We might need more recovery time because if I've just told you, trigger warning, that something made me feel suicidal and this is why I don't want you to do this, that takes its toll. So also we have imposter syndrome. Right, let me find where I am in my notes, sorry. And we're expected to bring our lived experience of what was and may still be a very, very difficult time in our lives and display it for everyone in that meeting to see. So then we're much harder on ourselves because we have to prove we're not just lived experience researchers, we have to prove that we are researchers. So it's harder for us to give ourselves grace. Now, I promise that this is not just an excuse to get my cats into a presentation, but work with me on this metaphor here, okay? Because basically lived experience workers are cats. Now I did ask before I made this slide if I could have this word in here because I really want to stand up in front of a group of people and say the word badass, but we are 4 kilos of badass because we have been through it, we've seen the other side, and we are here to be a menace to society. We are here to stand up for what is right, and we're here to be, badass about it. But we're also prey to anything bigger than us. So if you think you've got imposter syndrome, imagine trying to tell your brain and society that you're not less than, and always having that on the back of your mind when it's telling you otherwise. And I'll trigger warning, because I am going to use a word that I use about myself but not others. And that is that I was not hired because I'm crazy. I was hired because I'm a good researcher who happens to be crazy. And I was hired to bring my crazy to work with me every day. And that is the same reason why I peer review from a lived experience perspective, as well as writing from a That is why I write from a no, I'm just not going to get this sentence out, but you know where I'm trying to go with this. This is why I do what I do. Because I want to make that world just a little bit better. But if I don't get it right, I am perpetuating and enabling the same harm that happened to me to happen to other people. And not just that, I'm formalizing it in the scientific literature with a stamp on it that says lived experience approved. And that is a hard, huge responsibility, and it does take its toll, because nobody wants to become the system that harmed them and use it to harm other people. But saying that, we've changed the way Pegasus was originally conceived into something that we hope will actually make change in people's lives. Can't promise, but that's the hope at least. So what do I want you to take away from this? Number 1, report PPI enthusiastically and honestly. Do PPI, and for the love of all that is holy, report it, even if it was crap. Because even bad PPI we can learn from. But we can't if you're not honest about it and don't tell us what happened. Consider disclosing your own lived experience. And yes, I know it's scary, but I have found it liberating. The things that I've been able to use in order to try to battle stigma, to increase awareness and understanding and build empathy. They've been hard, but they've made me feel inside a bit of warm tingly, and I've heard feedback that they matter to people. And the last one is to find other ways to involve people with lived experience, not just as your PPI members. Help them build their brand. Help them to have that same level of self-confidence and belief, and the effects will ripple. And I have to believe this, is that the more we do the work that we're all doing here, and thank you so much for doing it, is that the more that we do it, the effects will ripple and we'll eventually see the world that we spend our entire working life striving to achieve. Are we questioning?
Well done. Thank you so much, Jessica. That was such a powerful and insightful and really honest account of your experience. Any questions from the audience? Tanya.
Much for that, and I don't know where to start. I'd like to ask you a question about just about everything you've said, and thank you on behalf of everyone for sticking with it and loving it so much. If I have to ask one question, it was sticking at the beginning from your first presentation on peer review with Lancet Psychiatry. Obviously, you don't review everything. There's 6 of you, and there's thousands of articles. Who decides which ones get PPI peer review? Without going into the entire and utter mechanism, it's obviously just a drop in the bucket. But who decides that?
It's the editors who decide. And I understand the reasons behind that, because obviously I'm not going to sit there and read every single thing that's submitted. It kind of feels like I'm the autism correspondent and the depression correspondent, but I do get given other things in other branches as well. I think that that's something that really needs to be thought about, because one of the ways that we've discussed is sending the paper out to everyone and seeing who comes back and reviewing it, but then you have unfairness, because what if somebody's on their emails first thing in the morning and somebody doesn't get up until 12 because they're on antipsychotic medication? So, you know, it's a difficult way to find that balance. Anything else before I go sit back down? Okay. Thank the Lord for the after lunch slot.
Thank you, Jessica. Okay, so our final speaker in this session is Dr. Anna Clark. Anna is the editor-in-chief of the Lancet Rheumatology. She obtained her PhD in neuroscience from King's College London in the UK, where she examined neuroimmune components to persistent pain with a focus on cytokine and protease communication between neurons and microglial cells in the spinal cord. She was a postdoctoral research fellow at King's College London and the Medical University of Vienna in Austria. She commenced her editorial career managing a portfolio of journals within the BMC series as an editor at Biomed Central, and then she served as an assistant editor at BMJ Open. She joined the Lancet Rheumatology's launch team as deputy editor in 2019, becoming editor-in-chief in July 2023. So, welcome, Dr. Clark, and I have your slides here. Yeah.
Thank you for the kind introduction. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can hear you.
Perfect. Well, thank you for the invitation to speak today. I'm Anna Clark, so I'm the editor-in-chief of the Lancet Rheumatology, which is one of the journals within the Lancet Group. I'm going to talk to you today about the Lancet Group's efforts to improve reporting of lived experience in our research articles. Next slide, please. So just a brief history about the Lancet Group for anyone who's not familiar. So the weekly Lancet journal was founded in 1823, and we recently celebrated the 200th anniversary. It was the only journal in the Lancet Group for the better part of 200 years, until the year 2000, when the first specialty journal, the Lancet Oncology, was launched. And then the group has steadily expanded ever since. We are now 27 journals across various specialties of medicine, and our newest journal, the Lancet Regional Health Africa, launched just this week. Next slide, please. So I should say that I'm a full-time professional editor, like Adrian, and my journal, the Lancet Rheumatology, has a team of 3 full-time editors. But we're a highly selective journal, and we publish very few research articles. So we actually do have the power to police what is being reported within our journal. So, as you're all very well aware, engagement of people with lived experience in research improves research quality and translation. And like any other part of the research process, it should be reported transparently and consistently. So in my area of rheumatology, rheumatologists are familiar with being asked to report their PPI. And this is largely because several of the highest impact rheumatology journals are published by the BMJ, and they've required research papers to include a PPI statement, as Adrian told us earlier. But at the Lancet Group, we haven't routinely included this information in manuscripts. So if it's been included in a submitted manuscript, then that's all very well, but we haven't been asking for authors to actively report on their PPI until recently. Next slide, please. So in rheumatology, the question is PPI being reported? So in June 2024, we published this meta-research analysis that examined reporting of PPI in high-impact rheumatology journals. And by high impact, they looked at journals with an impact factor of 5 or more in the Clarivate category of rheumatology in the year 2021. And they included 141 articles that included prospective human studies. And what they found was that only 9% of these studies reported engagement of people with lived experience in the article. And 4% included people with lived experience as co-authors. So 3% reported that they did not engage people with lived experience in the article. But then the researchers reached out by email to those authors that hadn't reported any engagement to ask them for further details of whether they had actually engaged lived experience. And what they found was that of the authors that responded, a lot of them who provided further information had actually carried out various aspects of PPI, but they hadn't mentioned this in their article. So engagement is happening, but it's not being reported. And this study estimated that somewhere between 29% and 44% of the research did actually engage people with lived experience. But it just wasn't being reported. And most of that engagement occurred in the planning stages of the study. Next, please. Oh, sorry, could you go back one? Thank you. So more broadly than rheumatology, there was an analysis published in the BMJ in 2025, so April this year, and they looked at reporting of PPI in clinical trials in 4 major medical journals. So that's the BMJ, JAMA, the New England Journal of Medicine, and the Lancet. And they looked at all areas of medicine and included the first 10 trials published in each of those journals in each year. And their analysis showed that only 18% of the trials reported PPI, and only 19% of the trial protocols reported PPI. So the level of reporting is very low across medicine. Okay, next, please. So at the Lancet Group, we've been working on how to improve reporting of PPI in our journals. So in January 2024, 3 Lancet journals began a 6-month pilot project asking authors to add detail on lived experience involvement in their research. So this project has been led by the Lancet Psychiatry. The comment you can see here was published in the Lancet Psychiatry announcing this project, and Jessica was involved in shaping this initiative. So the senior editor from the Lancet Psychiatry, Sophia Davis, worked with a number of the lived experience panel in order to decide which aspects of PPI were important for patients to know about. Next slide, please. So at the revision stage of a paper, what we are asking authors to report is on this slide here. So particularly important for the lived experience panel was that patient involvement should be stated in the abstract. So we are asking for a simple one-line statement in the study abstract to state if any lived experience involvement in the study occurred, or to state if no lived experience occurred. So you can see this from the abstract, even if you don't read the full paper. In the methods section, we're then asking for further details of exactly how people with lived experience were involved in, for example, shaping the research question, choosing outcome measures, working as lived experience researchers, and writing the study up, and dissemination. And we're also asking if authors are comfortable to declare positions of lived experience. So as Jessica mentioned, it can be very empowering for patients, and we are open to authors of the pieces declaring their lived experience if they feel comfortable to do so. And then in particular in the discussion for studies where there wasn't any lived experience involvement, we ask for this to be discussed as a limitation of the study. Next slide, please. So these are a couple of examples of methods sections from the abstracts of studies that have been published in the Lancet Rheumatology after this 6-month pilot project. So you can see that we're just asking for a very simple statement that states whether there was lived experience or whether there wasn't lived experience. So there's an example of each here. In the top example, people with lived experience were not involved in the research or writing process. And in the bottom example, people with lived experience of low back pain were involved in this trial from the outset. Next, please. This graph is data from an audit of the research articles published in the Lancet Rheumatology since we began this project. So the pink bars are the data from the 6 months after we started requesting this information. And the blue bars, or the one blue bar that you can see there, is what was happening before we started requesting this information. So 39% of research articles published in Lancet Rheumatology between June and December 2024, which is the 6 months after the project started, mentioned the involvement of people with lived experience or the absence of it in the abstract, compared to none of the articles published in the previous 6 months. So likewise, reporting of PPI in the methods section increased from 11% before we started asking to 57% afterwards. And these numbers have continued to increase in articles. So you can see in the purple bars the data from the first 5 months of this year, where we started routinely asking for this information. And 65% of these articles published this year report PPI in the abstract, with 85% of them reporting it in the methods. And in the discussion section, so this applies to studies that state that there was no PPI, then 21% and 30% of studies now discuss the fact that not having any PPI is a limitation of their study. So we've started to move the needle in the right direction, but we do have the power to police this, and because we only publish small numbers of research articles, we can check on each individual article So we're hoping going forward that we can get this up to 100%. So next slide, please. So the future at the Lancet Group. So the journals that took part in this pilot are all continuing because we had very positive feedback from our authors and very high adherence. And across the Lancet Group, all clinical trials will now report PPI, and that's because the Consort 2025 checklist now requires that PPI is reported. So Consort is now requiring that PPI is reported. It's stated who is involved and stated if there is no involvement. So all of the Lancet Group journals will be adopting that in line with Consort. And then several other of the Lancet Group journals have also joined us in requesting this information. And then just a little bit of an advert that we have a PPI themed issue of the Lancet Rheumatology coming in 2026. So keep an eye out for that. Thank you very much for listening.
We have time for one question, if anybody has a question for Dr. Clark.
Thank you very much, Anne. Derek Stewart, work out of the UK, but I'm here in Dublin. Just asking to report on whether there is involvement is brilliant. Thanks for doing that. You might like to subdivide. There's a difference between being involved to give an input and an insight into a research project, and it's very different from being a co-applicant on a bid or being on the trial management group. So having a subsection that describes what the involvement is would be helpful, because if you're doing a literature review, you can't find that differentiation. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Derek.
Thank you. Yes, yeah, I completely agree that obviously there's the potential for tokenism without actually having meaningful involvement. So in the main methods section, we do ask authors to describe in further detail the kind of engagement and involvement that occurred in their study. Yeah, we don't police this. So we're just asking for them to be honest and explain what they did. And it doesn't have any impact on our decision making to the paper at all. So yeah, we're relying on honesty of authors.
Good afternoon. Thank you very much for your presentation. I'm just wondering how patients get involved, what training is involved, and how you measure that and that comes from that.
So within the Lancet Group, the direct involvement of patients has all been led by the Lancet Psychiatry. And they have their own training programme for peer reviewers that Jessica has been involved in. And otherwise, we basically just invite people to reach out to us if they are interested in being involved in any aspect of the publishing process. We do encourage lived experience authors on all of our research articles, and also when we are commissioning reviews, we are looking for lived experience involvement in reviews so that we are giving patients the voice in those types of articles as well.
Thank you. I just was wondering, because would you have in the lived experience of rheumatology, how they would be involved. So will you be recruiting lived experience editors to the team?
Well, I do actually have lived experience of a rheumatic disease myself, so we do have lived experience editors on the team.
Thank you for being so open and sharing that. I live with rheumatic muscular disease myself.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.
Thanks very much, Anna.